So what took 2 hours before is taking 6 hours? What took 6 hours before is taking 12 hours? So, but anyway, by the end of the week, all the files of the week would be uploaded into the YouTube, again in the playlist. So you want to look at your playlist by 144, not at 2277, not at 145. And they are in sequence. Any question I can answer? So we'll be meeting at 10 o'clock for the lab. I won't be taking attendance unless you guys feel that attendance is a good thing. And that's completely fine. Then I'll go back to taking attendance, at least for the lab. And then all the files, image files, are now inserted into PowerPoint, which you can access from things to do on 4th week lab and 5th week anatomy lab, except for the joints. I haven't uploaded the joint images into a PowerPoint file yet. That might be on my to-do list, but there are only 3 or 4 images. So let's start with rest of the axial skeleton. A quick review. Any question I can answer? So we know axial skeleton. And I made this black background so that the bones stand out a little bit. So axial skeleton, as we know, comprises of skull, which we already covered, vertebral column, which we'll cover today, thoracic cage, which I'll likely not talk about unless there are questions, and the hyoid bone, which is kind of a standalone bone, and of course the ear ossicles, which there's no way we can cover them now, but we'll be covering them later when we're studying ear and ear structures, ear anatomy, which is toward the end of the semester. So skull, vertebral column, thoracic cage, hyoid bone, ear ossicle. So let's first look at some of these structures in integrated skeleton. So this is an integrated skeleton for the axial skeleton. So basically, besides skull, we got the vertebral column. We call it axial because it's along the axis of the body. If you draw a central line through the torso, basically that's the axis of the body. So the skeleton, that's basically along the axis of the body, is axial skeleton. So vertebral column, thoracic cage, and the hyoid bone. I don't know if you can see the hyoid bone, but it's right there. I have a picture of it later on. Hyoid bone is inferior to the mandible, almost posterior inferior, meaning the bone, part of the bone is actually behind the mandible, posterior to the mandible. When you're looking at the skeleton anteriorly, it's slightly below, part of the bone is slightly behind. This is the bone that serves as attachment for the tongue. That's its sole function. Hyoid bone is serves as the attachment for the tongue. If we just disarticulate, meaning extract that bone, this is what it would look like. Its function is to serve as attachment for the tongue. There are a couple of ligaments, but that's the main function, serve as the attachment for the tongue. So vertebral column. Vertebral column, again, some of you have studied ahead of time. The vertebral column basically is divided into 4 zones: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral plus coccygeal. So cervical area, thoracic zone or area, lumbar zone or area, sacral and coccygeal zone, which this is like a layman term, pelvic curve. This term is not really used anatomically. It's sacral and coccygeal. The intervertebral column, this is what's bearing our body's weight mostly. This and the long bones of the lower extremity. Have I started recording or have I not? Hang on. Yes, I have. So basically, vertebral column bears our body's weight because it's along the central line. It's like a midline of the body. So the intervertebral column isn't straight. It's rather curved. And it's curved for that reason. It's curved so that the body's weight can be well distributed and supported by the vertebral column. If it was just a straight vertebral curve, then we'll be all wobbly. So the cervical curve, the thoracic curve, the lumbar curve, the sacral, don't call coccygeal, but this is called sacral curve. Basically, this is how the curvature looks like. Just have a general idea. If you're looking at anteriorly, then this is basically concave, convex, concave, convex. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. Any deviation to this curve, basically if the lumbar curve is protruded to anteriorly, as you can see, the lumbar curve is anterior toward the protruded to anterior, thoracic curve is toward posterior, cervical is toward anterior, sacral is to posterior. That's the normal pattern. If there is any deviation to that, then there are conditions associated with it, like scoliosis, lordosis, etc. So, but this is the natural curvature of the vertebral column. What is this vertebral column made of? Again, vertebrae, vertebra individual, vertebrae plural. So basically, vertebral column is made of vertebrae. This vertebrae or vertebra individual are divided into zone. Cervical zone, which is referred to as those that constitute the cervical zone. You call them cervical vertebrae. Similarly, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, and of course, sacral vertebrae, and this little thing is coccygeal vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. Excuse me. So out of these, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. That's a landmark of us being mammal. 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae. The sacral and coccygeal vertebrae, basically these are fused together. So there is a single sacral vertebrae and coccygeal vertebra. Sacral vertebra and coccygeal vertebra. So let's look at a typical vertebral structure and how to distinguish between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. because I will be asking you that. Okay. Cervical vertebra, just to know, off the top of your head, I have pictures of 3 vertebrae here. And these you can actually level them yourselves. So just at a glance, cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, and average lumbar vertebra. Cervical vertebra basically gives us flexibility. We are humans. Here goes my dogs. We are humans. Without arthritis, without damage, without injury, we have an 180-degree rotation of our cranium. A cervical vertebra, the main function of the cervical vertebrae is to not only offer attachment site for muscle and movement, articulation, but also that flexibility. So when you look at cervical and average cervical vertebra, you will notice that it's a thin vertebra. This is cervical. This is thoracic. And this is lumbar. Cervical is the thinnest vertebra. Look at the size of this mass here. Thoracic is a little larger, a little heavier. Lumbar is the heaviest. Then we are going to look at the different structures, name these different parts, and look at the distinctions there. So C1 through C7, I actually have provided with names here, picture with names here. Come on now. C1. C1 and C2, the first cervical vertebra and the second cervical vertebra, they are given different names because they look different from all the other cervical vertebrae. C1 is called atlas. Basically, this is what I was trying to show last class. Atlas directly articulates with the cranium. So remember, we studied the occipital condyle. Basically, the occipital condyles are articulating against this flatter surface of the C1 or the atlas. So let me see what we have for atlas. Okay, I only have identification for the atlas. It has anterior arch, posterior arch, and transverse process. Okay, that's it. So atlas, which looks like a ring, you can study the average structures of a vertebra in atlas because it's very different. But identify atlas as atlas. The second, C2, axis. This looks a little more like an average vertebra, but still not really. Axis or C2 is identifiable by this special superior protrusion. Remember, a long protrusion is a process. This is referred to as odontoid process or simply dens. The actual anatomic name is odontoid process. I have no idea where this dens word came from. That's an anglicized, because I never heard of this when I was going through my studies, which is, mimicking the European system. Odontoid process. So this odontoid process, basically, if we are to draw the atlas, then this atlas, this part of the atlas, see this part of the atlas, basically atlas would be like a ring as present here. What this odontoid process does, it also, among other things, it stabilizes the cranium. So the atlas is here, the surface of the atlas that articulates with occipital condyle is here. This basically stabilizes the cranium. that is. Okay. If we want to look at the average structures of the vertebra, then we have to look at the cervical vertebra C3 through C7. All cervical vertebra, without the exception of atlas and axis, share the common structure with all other vertebrae. So this could be an average vertebra in the body. Okay. So I have this and I have this as well. So I like this. The clarity is a little better. Some of my pictures had too much glare because we have these plastic bones from the lab that I was trying to take pictures from at home, and the glare is just too much. So I found these online pictures of real bones. This is real bone, as you can see. And the quality is so much better, I figured that that's what I'm going to use. Okay, so let's learn the typical structures of a vertebra. So this flatter, this is how the vertebra stays, always oriented with the vertebral column. There is a disc of the vertebra. Every vertebra has a disc-like part and has a long protrusion posteriorly. So just off right now, of any average vertebra, this disc is called the centrum. So all the centrum of all the vertebrae will stack on top of one another with cartilages in between. And this is what gives rise to the vertebral column that we can see anteriorly. See that? Basically, each of this disc, this is centrum. The spine that we can feel on our back, right in the midline, that line, basically the spine is constituted by collective spinous processes. So this long protrusion toward the posterior aspect, which is, this is anterior. Anteriorly we see centrum, posteriorly we see spinous process, called the spinous process. Process is a long extension, spinous because it gives rise to spine. Just looking at the average vertebral column, what else can we see? We see these side processes that are projecting laterally. These lateral projections, we refer to this as transverse process. Processes in this case because we are referring to many vertebrae here. So let's transfer this centrum, spinous process, transverse process here. Every vertebra will have a centrum. So this is the disc, centrum. This is the spinous process, this and this. I'm going to draw it in a different color maybe, that way, both of them. Plus I love colors. These two are spinous processes. What else can we see? See this round. I wish you could touch and feel, but anyway, see this somewhat rounder, more obtuse connecting part to the centrum. This. Each one, basically this one on left, one on right, each one is called pedicle. Together we call it pedicles. So next to the centrum, the rounder connecting part that's giving rise to the ascending. If you think of this an arch, basically this is the ascending part of the arch. So this here to here is pedicles. Then this flatter part. So again, if this is an arch, then this flatter part, top of the arch, this are referred to individually as lamina, plurally laminae. Lamina meaning flatter, thinner. So pedicles, laminae, individual, lamina. Got that? So centrum, every vertebra will have it, regardless of course, with the exception of atlas and sacral and coccygeal vertebrae, which are very different. Every cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebra will have this part. There will be centrum, there will be spinous process, there will be transverse process, there will be pedicles, there will be laminae, and then the last. What we see, this looks like it's projecting on the side. This is actually projecting up because this is image. This is what it looks like. I'm going to change the color so that you know which part I'm talking about. Talking about this. This is actually projecting up. It projects up from the transverse process. In the image, it looks like, you know, two-dimensional. Because it projects up from the level of the centrum or the pedicles, these two are referred to as superior articular processes. Again, individual process, plural processes. And almost all of these are, I have provided a picture with all of the names in a thoracic vertebra rather. Superior articular process, and this flat cut, see this? This cut, as if, imagine you have a piece of round plastic that you cut at an angle, or take a bead, cut at an angle, glass, cut at an angle. Have you ever heard the term faceted bead, faceted diamond, faceted emerald? Basically, facet is an angular cut. Because this is like an angular cut, as if the process has been cut at an angle, this is referred to as superior articular facet. Individual facets, plural. So, superior articular facet. These facets are the one via which the vertebra articulates with the vertebra above it. So, going back here again, I'm going to erase this writing so that we can look at the vertebral column a little better. So here, look at this. Each vertebra articulates with the vertebra below, and the vertebra below articulates with the vertebra above, meaning they have to fit together. A vertebral column has flexibility. We turn this way and turn that way and go down and go up, right? So basically, this superior articular process and facet, that cut, facet is basically where the vertebra is articulating with the vertebra above it, which means the vertebra above it must have an inferior articular process and facet. So here is the inferior view. How do you know this is inferior? learn how to distinguish instead of trying to memorize. Look at the spinous process. Look here. See how the spinous process is up, curved up, convex. Look at the spinous process here. It's curved down, concave. This is how you know this is inferior view. So as we can see, this vertebra, superior articular process and facet. What do we have in the inferior view? Inferior articular process. Basically, it's the same extension. Think of it's like a kind of like a hourglass. This is what called superior. This is what we call inferior. Basically, that's what we are looking at. Inferior articular process. And inferior articular facet. Here and here. Every vertebra will have these structures. Every vertebra will have a centrum, transverse process, spinous process, pedicle, laminae, superior articular process. You don't see the facet because it's inferior view. Inferior articular process. Process is the part, facet is the cut. Think of it that way. Inferior articular facet. And on a superior view, superior articular process, superior articular facet. Do we get this?
Professor, I have a question. I'm assuming, maybe it was mislabeled, the spinous process in the blue color, is that actual, would you consider the transverse process another type of spinous process? Is that why it's labeled a spinous process?
Oh, you know what? I said transverse and I wrote spinous, didn't I?
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I assume that's what happened.
Thank you. I said this is the spinous process and I was thinking, I don't know why I was thinking transverse. I said transverse and I wrote spinous, didn't I? Jeez. That's what happens when you are compromised, I guess. Transverse
Thank you for clarifying.
Process. No, thank you for catching it. If you catch mistakes like that, please let me know. Normally, I don't make this kind of mistakes, too many of them, but this semester is different. I apologize. Transverse process. So, centrum, look at this, which is not marked as much. Centrum, transverse process, pedicle, laminae, spinous process. Here in the inferior view, which you can tell by looking at the spinous process, inferior articular process and facet. Basically, cut is the facet, what remains is the process. On the superior view, superior, same thing, superior articular process and facet. Cut is the facet, what remains is the process. And these are very clearly visible if you are looking at an actual 3D vertebra. But again, we are doing the best we can. So you'll see all of this in the thoracic vertebra as well. Okay, so this is like a marked picture. Facet on your list for thoracic vertebra. Yes, I do. Huh? Wait. What is this? Yes, I'm screen sharing, I know. Can you guys see the thoracic vertebra?
Yes.
Okay, because on my computer, it's just my screen sharing has been paused. Okay, so anyway. So looking at this, thoracic vertebra, this is what I was saying. The thoracic vertebra is a little heavier. Look at the centrum, it's a little heavier. So how is this different from this? And let me erase some of this writing so that we can get to see the actual vertebral column a little better.
Professor, on your screen, we do see the thoracic vertebra, but it's from the side angle. That's the labeled picture.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what
You
you're
don't
writing
see
on.
me. You don't see me doing things with the cervical vertebra right now.
No.
Excuse me. Okay, what's up with that? I'm just going to stop the share and start again. I don't know. This is what's happening. This Zoom is freezing halfway, knocking the whole screen out. Now, do you see the cervical vertebra?
Yes.
Do you see me erasing some writing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excuse me. All right, so cervical vertebra. Just at a glance, what do you see is different? Can you see two things? Besides this being much lighter body, we already know that. For a cervical vertebra, the specialty of cervical vertebra is a thin centrum. Overall, it's a lighter vertebra, lighter body. Can you see something here that you don't see here? Yeah. Focus here.
There's only one spinous process?
Exactly. So basically, thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra, the spinous process is straight and intact, undivided. In cervical vertebra, one of the characteristics is spinous process. This is called a bifid spinous process split. That's the second characteristic of cervical vertebra. These are unique features. Thin centrum, lighter vertebra, thin centrum, bifid spinous process or bifid. Have you heard the condition known as spina bifida, meanful condition, where the spinous process basically is totally separated? So that's come from this bifid or bifid spinous process. So bifid spinous process, split like a fishtail. Bifid basically represents almost like a fishtail, how a fishtail separates. It starts out as one, then it separates into two. Not completely separated, but it gives two split ends. And focus here, look at the transverse process. The transverse process has an opening in it. We don't see that here. It's lumbar vertebra, solid transverse process. Thoracic vertebra, solid transverse process. Cervical vertebra, there's an opening, hole through the transverse process. This is the third characteristic, unique feature, presence of this is called transverse trying to write here. Learning how to write. Foramina. Transverse foramina together. If you are referring to one, you call it transverse foramen. These are three special features of cervical vertebrae only. You won't find them in thoracic, you won't find them in lumbar. So what would be unique features of thoracic vertebra? First of all the structures are there. Body, which is basically same as centrum. You can see the transverse process, the spinous process, the pedicles, the laminae or lamina. If there are more names here, you can, like vertebral arch. I used to have that. Now I just replaced it with vertebral foramen. So the opening within a vertebra is basically vertebral foramen. This is where the vertebral column will pass through. Not vertebral column, the spinal cord will pass through vertebral foramen. And these are all given name. This is called vertebral arch. This is called neural arch, but basically we're not learning everything. We're learning the main features. So let's look at the side view. The two unique features of thoracic vertebra. One is, again, look at the spinous process. Spinous process is protruding downward. Inferiorly projected spinous process. Another feature is when we look at the centrum, because thoracic vertebra, each one articulates with ribs. So when we look at the centrum, on each inferior aspect of the centrum on the left and the right, we'll see a facet, a cut. That's referred to as demi-facet, what they're calling costal facet. This is called demi-facet. So I'm going to write that, superior demi-facet, inferior demi-facet. So this cut and this cut. Again, from the image, you know, you can see like a dip there. That's what demi-facet looks like. This is a plastic bone. Another feature is when you look at the transverse process, which I'm going to trace here. So all image, what are you going to do? Transverse process, the edge of the transverse process, basically when you're looking at this, the edge of the transverse process. Same thing, is because of the ribs. It has to articulate with ribs. There is a facet, like as if a surface that has been cut. That's called transverse facet. So inferiorly projected spinous process. Second is presence of demi-facets. This is what I have in the lab manual. The list that I provided as well. On centrum. And the third one is transverse. It's not very clear, is it? The shade has changed here. Blue maybe? Yes. Perfect. Transverse facets. one on each transverse process. Rest of it you can see: superior articular process, superior articular facet, inferior articular process, inferior articular facet. So 3 features of the thoracic vertebra that are unique: inferiorly projected spinous process, demifacet because the ribs articulate here, and basically the ribs attach here and here. So transverse facet. Question? Compare
I have
that
a
to the
quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
When looking at it from the side angle, I know you said that the rib goes into, or like fits in with the thoracic vertebrae. There's like that thumb looking like space. Does it go all the way in there, or does it just rest on those demifacets, like the in between the inferior articulatory process with facets and the inferior demifacet? I'm just confused where the rib fits.
Oh, you mean this? This space you were referring to?
Yes.
Oh no, the rib doesn't pass through that, if that's what you are asking.
Okay.
Basically, the way the rib will go, let's look at the vertebral column here. The rib cage actually will give us some idea. Look at the back. See that?
Mm-hmm.
So basically the ribs attach to the demifacet, then attach on the transverse facet. I won't say attach, but it rests on those facets, and then the rib cage turns anteriorly and attaches to the sternum. So if we are to draw that, if you have to draw the rib here, basically a rib has a head also, which would be attaching here. Basically the rib will attach here, here, and then project anteriorly. Basically that's how the rib will be, and it would attach to sternum here. And the other pair would start like that too. So the part of the rib will fit into this notch and this notch. Part of the rib will fit into this notch, and then the rib will continue. This is how the thoracic cage is, right? It's laterally projected, and then the rib goes toward the anterior, and this is where it attaches to the either the sternum or the costal cartilage. Yeah, those things you really, it's hard to do that along images, but what else are you going to do? Did that answer?
Thank you. Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So lumbar vertebra. Moving on, again, this is a nice one. It's a real bone. Lumbar vertebra, superior view. So you can label this basically the same things: the centrum, the transverse process, the spinous process, the superior articular process, the facet. Lumbar vertebra, basically the sheer size, they're much wider. Look at the thoracic vertebra here. Look at the lumbar vertebra. They're wide, they are heavy, especially when you compare these 3 here. And lumbar vertebra is like less specialized. It's identifiable not so much by what it has, but what it doesn't have. For example, no transverse foramina, no inferiorly projecting spinous process. If you look at posterior view, that's how the lumbar vertebra would look like. Actually, this is a nicer view. So this is a pretty straight, heavy, thick centrum, heavy vertebra. The spinous process is projecting posteriorly, not inferiorly. If you look at the superior, this is the superior articular process. And then this is the superior articular facet. Same with this inferior articular process. And here, this is the inferior articular facet. Then you can see that the location of the process and the facet is slightly different than thoracic vertebrae. If you look at the cervical and thoracic, the superior articular process goes straight up from the centrum, straight down from the spinous process. Or let's say from the pedicles, straight up from the pedicles, straight down from the pedicles. So the articular facet is facing posteriorly or anteriorly, straight up, straight down. Here it is, that's the process, straight. In lumbar vertebra, if you can see the superior articular process and the facet is turned inward. So although the articular process itself is projecting superiorly, but it's also turned. It's not straight up, it's more like turned. So the articular facet, superior articular facet and inferior articular facet, as you can see, it's not straight projecting posteriorly, but little bit medially. That's pretty much the unique feature of lumbar vertebra. So it's more identified by what it doesn't have. No transverse foramina, no inferiorly projecting spinous process, no bifid spinous process, no demifacet, and slightly turned superior and inferior articular process and facet, thick centrum, lumbar vertebra. And I wish we could do all of this in lab with actual vertebra, where you could touch and feel the vertebra. And here is a comparison of all three. I would strongly recommend that you can use this file to do a little bit of self-study. Label whatever you can label. Question? Okay, sacrum, I just have apex and base. So sacrum is pretty obvious looking vertebra. Anterior view, posterior view, that's what that curve, sacral curve is. I only have base and apex. Okay, so base and apex, if you don't know it yet, typically any organ that has a conical shape, like lungs, like heart, you'll always, and sacrum, you'll always come up with this term base and apex. Base is the wider portion. Apex is the pointy portion. So you write it as sacral base or base of sacrum, apex of sacrum. Otherwise, base, which apex, multiple organs have it. I could not find a picture of, well, or maybe I didn't look hard enough, of coccygeal vertebra alone, but coccygeal vertebra is so, basically that's the last three vertebrae fused together. So I won't worry too much about the coccygeal. Did we get that? Vertebral column. Sternum is pretty self-explanatory. We have just manubrium body and xiphoid process. So I'm going to quickly level this. Actually, it's not so much higher up. That's what this is a fake one. That's what it shows. Actual xiphoid process is much thinner than that. And actual sternum, xiphoid process is thin. It's thin like this. This is the process, the xiphoid process, which is projecting inferiorly. If an inexperienced person giving CPR and applying too much pressure, this is the process that can break and protrude and damage the lungs. It can pierce the lungs and damage the lungs. This is why, you know, you have to be careful when you are giving CPR. You have to be trained. I mean, you have to be trained for multiple reasons, but this is one of them. An inexperienced person might just put pressure on too close to the xiphoid process, and the process breaks because it's a thin, very thin process, and it takes a long time to completely ossify. Meaning, long bones, these all start from cartilage. Xiphoid process in an adult might still be partly cartilaginous, which is why it's much softer than the rest of the bone. It takes a long time to ossify. So it might just break and then pierce the lungs. I'm pretty sure you can study the ribs. I have given you some reference here. There's nothing special about the ribs that require, you know, my assistance. You can do that study on your own. If there are questions, I'll answer them. Okay, so that's basically our axial skeleton. Did we all get this? Are there questions? The picture qualities are so much better. Okay, so then I'm going to move on to the pelvic, sorry, I keep saying pelvic for some reason. Pectoral girdle today. What now the mice? The mouse stopped working here on a second. So I'm going to bring up the other file. Okay, yes, screen sharing has stopped. So I'm going to bring up the pectoral girdle and cover as much as we can. So let me start a new share here. Okay, can you see the pectoral girdle slide?
Yes, this the title slide.
It's just the title slide, yes. All right, so appendicular skeleton. And again, like I said, if there are questions about ribs and, you know, I'll answer those. Rib, clavicle, fibula, typically I leave those out. Femur also. So let's look at now we are starting appendicular skeleton. So basically we had axial skeleton so far. Now we are talking about appendicular skeleton. Appendicular, break down the term. What does that mean? What does it include? Appendicular, that term comes from appendages, which basically stands for your upper and lower extremities. Our hands and our legs, upper and lower extremities. So we got the axial skeleton along the axis of the body. Then we got appendages, upper and lower extremities. And we have bony structures, cage-like structures that are attaching those appendages to the axial skeleton. Okay. So appendicular skeleton literally includes the bones of upper and lower extremities, plus these structures that are attaching the extremities to the axial skeleton. So these structures that are in place to serve as things that can attach the appendages to axial skeleton, refer to those as girdles. This and this. So appendicular skeleton includes the bones of the upper and lower extremity, plus the two girdle that attach the appendages to the axial skeleton. So if you have this distribution, you won't be confused. We got a skeletal along the axis, the cranium, the vertebral column, the rib cage, blah, 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 blah. And then we got the appendages. Those appendages and the bony structures, the girdles that attach the appendages and tie them to the axial skeleton. That's what we study for appendicular skeleton. So basically looking at that, pectoral and pelvic girdle. So pelvic girdle, we'll talk about that next class. Let's try and cover pectoral girdle. Okay. And bones of upper extremities as much as I can. So here it just shows you the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton in two different colors. Let me see if I have the long bones here as well. Yes, I do. So pectoral girdle, let's break that first. Right here, pectoral girdle is the bony structure that's attaching the bone of upper extremity, which is the bone of our arm, to the axial skeleton. Okay. So pectoral girdle consists of clavicle, two, one on left, one on right, scapula. Gosh, I'm thinking something, I'm writing something else. Scapula. When you say two scapulae, call it scapulae, individual is scapula. Clavicle or clavicles, when you refer to two, scapulae. Clavicle is this collarbone, so you got one on left. Scapula is the shoulder blade. Anteriorly, you can see the clavicle. Posteriorly, you can see the scapulae. I mean, you can see anterior aspects too in a skeleton. Basically, this is what pectoral girdle is all about. Out of which clavicle is very straightforward. I think we only have, let me see, what do I have for clavicle? Sternal end, acromial end, I believe. Yes, that's all we have. Okay. So basically, clavicle, collarbone. So two different, this is the real bone, that's a plastic bone. Real bone, look at the clarity of the real bone. So basically, the clavicle, this bone articulates with two different parts. One is with sternum, one is with the scapula, right? With sternum, right there with scapula, medially with sternum, laterally with scapula. When it comes to the, from now onward, the medial, lateral, superior, inferior, anterior, posterior will come extremely handy because so many names are based on that. So medially with sternum, laterally with scapula. How do you know which end is what? Basically, look at the edges. There is one rounder, one flatter. One rounder, one flatter. See that? Obtuse end and flatter end. Obtuse or the round end is the sternal end. Flatter end is the acromial end. Why do we call it acromial end? Because you will see the part it articulates with is called acromion process. So clavicle is pretty simple. Scapula. Okay, first thing you want to do, let's look at that. And I will ask you, especially for scapula and the long bones, whether it's belonging to the left or to the right. And you will know how to identify, distinguish between left and right by identifying some landmark structure first. Lots of names are going to come your way. So the best way to learn the bone is not just go through the regions of the bone. You want to go through the one area of the bone, especially, for long bone. Let's say you take the proximal end and you study everything, then the distal end, you study all of them together. Bones like scapula, but also you want to find at least one landmark feature, which tells you which aspect of the bone am I looking at. Is it anterior or is it posterior? So scapula, the shoulder blade, basically, this is what articulates with the bone that forms our arm, the humerus. Good here. I think I have scapula and humerus together somewhere. Maybe I'm thinking of the textbook. So anyway, humerus. Humerus is a long bone. So once you identify which part of the scapula the humerus articulates with, then you know which aspect is posterior, which aspect is anterior, and then superior and inferior becomes clear, right? Because humerus is easily identifiable. You know that your humerus is on the left or the humerus on the right. Basically the bone that forms your arm. So the part of the scapula where the humerus articulates with, humerus is a long bone with a part known as the head. We'll look at that in a second. Don't worry about the rest of it. Basically, the head of the humerus articulates with a lateral, it doesn't look anything like the humerus, but you get the point. A lateral depression here. This depression, you can't miss it. It's very easy to locate. This depression, this, which articulates with the humerus, the head of the humerus articulates next to this. This is referred to as glenoid. Some call it glenoid cavity, some call it glenoid fossa. Cavities really should not be called cavities. It's not a cavity, it's a fossa. But that term is there. If you have an older textbook, if it calls it glenoid cavity, then that used to be an alternate term. So glenoid fossa right there. Identify the glenoid fossa and you immediately know that this is projecting laterally. Yes, because your arm is lateral to your body, torso that is. So first, that's the first thing you want to identify. You want to identify which side is anterior, which side is posterior, which will tell you what's superior, what's inferior. So once you know that, oh, that's the glenoid fossa, that's supposed to be turning toward the arm. This is where my arm will be. Okay, so this must be the medial aspect. No. This must be the why is it moving the slide? Medial aspect. This must be the lateral aspect. And lots of the names are given as medial border, lateral border, superior angle, inferior angle. Okay, so from that perspective, let's start naming the other things here, other structures. So you got this medial and the lateral, how we identified. You want to do that. Even when we are studying bone in the lab, scapula is a difficult bone because it doesn't have a very well pronounced symmetric shape. It's very asymmetric. And this and the long bone. You want to identify first thing is what's anterior, what's posterior, what's medial, what's lateral. Basically, the lateral medial gives you the anterior posterior. So you want to identify at least one landmark feature and learn from that reference, because that tells you, okay, I'm looking at the back. If I'm looking at the back of my body, this is the back of my shoulder blade, because this is where the arm will be, glenoid fossa. All right, so now that we know lateral and medial, guess what? We call this border medial border. And guess what we call this border, this edge? Lateral border. And then guess what we call these angles? I see that there's an angle. The bone is projecting at an angle. Angle here, angle here. What do we refer to this angle as? Superior angle. Because now I know that's the superior, that's how the bone is in the body. Superior angle, inferior angle. Then, how about this bony ridge? You can clearly see it's a rising bony ridge. This ridge, this is referred to as scapular spine, or you can call it spine of scapula. As if the scapula has a spine, because it's raised and it gives rise to a clear ridge. So we can see superior angle, inferior angle, medial, lateral border, glenoid fossa, and scapular spine. All of that's visible on the posterior aspect. Something else. If this is the scapular spine, guess what we call this depression here? And this depression here, right at the base of the spine. A depression is a, what again?
Fossa.
Fossa. And so this is the spine. Superior to the spine, inferior to the spine, fossa. So what would this name of this would be? The fossa that's superior to the scapular spine. What do you think the name is?
Supraspinous fossa.
Thank you. Supraspinous fossa. Similarly, infraspinous fossa. Here is the infraspinous fossa, here is the supraspinous fossa. So although in anatomy, the names seem, if you don't go by understanding what the names tell you and go by this, like I said, hallmark features, everything will be random and mixed and it will be very overwhelming. In a face-to-face class, I also say that make sure you are learning from the 3D perspective. Otherwise, just learning the image and being tested on real bone doesn't help, but we don't have any 3D aspect here. But still, these are skills. This is part of also, arriving at a conclusion by step-by-step process. You want to have your thought process in that, organized in that order. This is how you want to think. You have a structure in your hand. The first thing they want to do that, is there anything that's remarkable that helps me identify what side of this, how is it in the body? What aspect am I looking at, posterior or anterior? Okay, for that, a bone like scapula, which otherwise will be very overwhelming. If you just try to memorize all of this, imagine how challenging that's going to be. But it's not challenging. Once you identify one landmark, and most bones have something landmark. You identify the landmark, identify the anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, the rest of it is pretty simple. 90% of the structures are named according to medial, lateral, superior, inferior, in relation to something. Now, when we look at the anterior aspect, so basically we looked at the posterior aspect. Now we are looking at the anterior aspect. Make sure that you identify most of the structures from both aspects. Again, the same thing. Here is the glenoid. That is the lateral. So which scapula are we looking at? Is this left or right?
Right.
Okay, good. Good. So glenoid. And which one is this then? Left or right?
The left.
Yes. Okay. So this glenoid cavity, I found that, once you know this just clears so many things. It makes a understanding so much easier. Okay, so what all can I say? And I'll show you another clearer picture. These plastic bones, they don't have the best pictures. Okay, so this is the anterior view. You can still see the superior angle, inferior angle, medial border, lateral border. This is the right, so that's basically which border is this? Lateral or medial? If this is where your arm is, this will be
medial.
This is your arm is?
Lateral.
Lateral, away from the midline. This will be the medial border. Medial is closer to the midline, lateral is away from the midline. This is where your arm will be. Arms are on the side, they're on lateral to your body's axis. Lateral border, medial border, superior angle, inferior angle. And then here is this depression, this fossa. What do we call it? We refer to this as subscapular fossa. Subscapular because it's when the scapula is tilted, this is on the inferior aspect. If this is tilted, if scapula is tilted, it is on the inferior aspect, subscapular fossa. What else can we see? We see two processes. There is one, here is one. Not too clear. Let's look at another view here. There's a process that seems like it's attached to the edge of the scapular spine. And the other one seems like it's protruding along the glenoid cavity. So just like we saw here. One's attached to the scapular spine, one that's protruding along the glenoid cavity, sorry, glenoid fossa. So these are named based on the structure, what the shape is. The superior one, this is on this view here. This is the acromion. Better actually, it should be referred to as acromion process. I know the textbook just calls this acromion. I always learned it as acromion process. Long flat. And this one here, that's along the glenoid cavity. This is referred to as coracoid process. That covers all of the structures we need to know for scapula. You can learn it here too, acromion process, coracoid process. Same here, acromion process, coracoid process. Question?
Yeah, Professor, for the glenoid cavity, can you use fossa? Yeah, do you want to use fossa instead of the cavity?
Fossa, yeah. Cavity is an older terminology. I mean, you know, in fact, I sometimes by mistake call it cavity because I've seen it so many times. Glenoid fossa. The rule of thumb, kind of like how I have stated in the syllabi, sometimes you'll see that in the lab manual, and the lists that I'm providing are basically from the lab manual, there might be a little bit of spelling discrepancy, like an extra E somewhere, or an extra A, or maybe it's spelled as OE instead of just O. Basically, that's Latinized spelling. I would prefer the way it's spelled in the manual and the terminologies in the manual. So I have glenoid fossa in the manual, and that's what we'll go by, glenoid fossa. Cavity used to be called glenoid cavity, but appropriately, it's not really an opening. Cavity is an opening. This is a fossa. All right, so next, let's look at some of the long bones. We have humerus, in the anterior and posterior view. So humerus, radius and ulna. So I'm showing you some of the pictures. These are, you will find them in the textbook too. I just thought they were nice. You can see how the bones articulate. I can't show it to you. Okay, so our goal is to cover. I think we should be able to cover the humerus. Typically, radius is pretty self-explanatory. I'll cover humerus, ulna, and I will cover the carpal bones. Okay, so the long bones of the upper extremity. So let's first know where these bones are. The bone that makes up your arm is humerus. The bones that make up your forearm are radius and ulna. You can see radius and ulna. How do you know which one is what? Again, that medial, lateral, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. let's just look at the bones. The bones that make up your wrist, and I have better pictures along the way, are carpals. 8 bones that make up your wrist are the carpals. The bones that make up your palm, metacarpals. Bones that make up your fingers are phalanges. So we are looking at the extremity, humerus, bone that make up your arm. Your arm constitutes of humerus. Your forearm constitutes of radius and ulna. Your wrist constitutes of carpals. Your palm, metacarpals. Then the digits, fingers, phalanges. So we'll go in that order. Once you identify the different features of the humerus, basically every other long bone becomes pretty easy to understand. So I got this image where I have the anterior and posterior aspect of the humerus. Textbook also has pretty nice images of the humerus. So first thing first, let's look at this here. So we learned just a little while ago that the scapula, the glenoid fossa of the scapula, that's what we learned here. The glenoid fossa of the scapula, that's where the round globular head of the humerus fits into, articulates with. The anatomical term is articulates with. So if we are just looking at this one here, look at that globular part, round globular part. This is what we refer to as the head of the humerus, which articulates with glenoid fossa. So is this left humerus or right humerus? This articulates with this.
The right.
What was that? Good.
The right.
The right humerus. Okay. Then tell me if this is number 1 and this is number 2. Which one is an image of the anterior aspect? Which one is posterior?
One is anterior, 2 is posterior.
Good, good. It's a different thing, you know, looking at the images, but yes, that's why again the landmark feature is the head. Once you identify the head, then you'll, oh yeah, that's right. So this is where the scapula is going to be. This is where the axis of the body is going to be. That means this bone is turned the right way. It is the right humerus, and this is the anterior aspect. This is the posterior aspect. We'll look at this separately in a second. So let's look at the anterior aspect and look at this real bones. They're so much better in picture. I mean, those are real bones too, but the plastic bones just have such a glare taking pictures with. I mean, I took pictures, ton of them, and I finally didn't know what to do. It just had that glare. Okay, so anterior aspect of the humerus, by the way, this is right humerus. So the head of the humerus. Head is protruding. This is where your body will be, right? This is where the scapula will be, and da, 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 da. This is where the axis of the body is going to be. That means this is the medial side. That's the lateral side. For long bone, you immediately, just like scapula, you want to know the anterior, posterior. That tells you the medial and lateral side of the bone. because a lot of this protrusion, especially along the edge, are named based on medial and lateral. Okay. So head is on the medial side. This is the medial. This is the lateral side of the bone. Keeping that in mind, now let's start naming some of the structures that we have on the list. And oftentimes I hear from students that, oh really, oh, this list is so long. And usually I say, well, actually look at all the structures that we are not learning. That list is actually longer. So I have an anatomical neck and a surgical neck. You should know that because again, if you're going to be in ER nursing or assisting orthopedic doctors, then that's something that you need to know. Anatomical neck, surgical neck. First thing is head. This is the head of the humerus. Learning to write here. Head of the humerus. Okay, so what is anatomical neck? Anatomical neck is in a long bone. What comes below the anatomical head is the anatomical neck. So if this is the head, basically this line, see what comes immediately below? If we draw a line right where the head ends, this will be considered the anatomical neck. Just like our head, below that comes our neck. However, the surgical neck of the humerus is where you see the first constriction. See how it's wide and it's constricted. The constriction is beginning here. See that? This is wide. This is the first constriction. This first constriction, this is what we refer to as the surgical neck of humerus. You want to always refer it to as of humerus. Why is it called surgical neck? Because if there is most of the time, if there is a fracture from a fall or trauma, typically it's along the surgical neck. That's why this serves as a landmark. Head of the humerus, anatomical neck of the humerus, surgical neck of the humerus. So what would be these two protrusion or protuberance rather? Remember the round bump is typically give the name tubercle if it's rather smooth and round, tuberosity if it's rather rough and not round. The last class, that's what we learned. So these would be called tubercle. Which tubercle is what? Based on what's above, what's below. It actually is also based on what's larger and what's smaller. But in a real bone, oftentimes this is larger, this is smaller. So greater tubercle and lesser tubercle. These tubercles, ridges, lines, these pretty much serve as attachments for muscle. Various muscles attached to this, tuberosities, tubercles, etc. Line, tuberosity. We'll go over this on different bones. You'll see line, tuberosity, tubercle. Typically, those are for muscle attachment. Fossa, cavity, condyle, epicondyle, not so much epicondyle, but condyle. Those are basically for bone-to-bone interaction. Typically, the ends are for bone-to-bone interaction, right? This is for one bone, scapula. This is for another bone, radius ulna. So just like occipital condyle, bone-to-bone interaction. So this is greater tubercle. I'm running out of space. And this is lesser tubercle, greater tubercle, lesser tubercle. The textbook has pretty nice images. You shouldn't have any problem identifying this, but I do like to go over the more complex bones. What do we call the body? Well, the body is pretty simple, shaft. Then basically what I have listed in the lab manual is in the order. As if you are going from here toward the distal end. So we call proximal end, distal end. This is the distal end. This is the proximal end, closer to the body. So when you are going from the proximal end to the distal end of a long bone, especially here in the humerus, I have listed the structures in that order, what you will encounter as if you are observing the bone from here downward toward the distal end. So the head, the anatomical neck, surgical neck, the two tubercles, shaft. Along the shaft, look at this ridge. See that? Ridge and slight protrusion. It's a rough protrusion. If you can't, but if you could touch this, if you could rub your finger over this, it feels very rough to touch. It's not a smooth thing at all. And it's not round. So this is a tuberosity. Only tuberosity, or do you have something else? Deltoid tuberosity. Because this serves as attachment point for the deltoid muscle. Deltoid tuberosity. Question so far?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way you can erase a little bit at the top and show the
Yes,
greater tubercle?
Yes. Actually, let me erase the anatomical and surgical neck. Greater tubercle and lesser tubercle. That's what you are wondering about, right?
Yes.
So greater tubercle is what's superior, lesser tubercle is what's inferior. See, this is above, this is below. So that's referred to as greater tubercle. That's why it's called greater, because it's above. If you ever get a chance to look at a humerus or plastic replica, size-wise, this is actually larger, but the name is based on where it is. Greater tubercle. This is the lesser tubercle. You can also remember, another way to remember is what's on the other side of the head, lateral, what's closer to the medial. Oftentimes when I'm in doubt, or when I was learning, when I was in doubt, or even now, sometimes I'm in doubt. You don't know everything, right? A lot of things I don't know. I always fall back to this baseline: lateral, medial, proximal, distal, anterior, posterior. If it's long bone, proximal, distal. If it's any other bone, I always fall back on that reference line. And things will make sense. So try to attach something instead of this is. Attach something else. Another, these are all characters in a story. What else can you attach to this character? Instead of giving it a name that this was Tom, that was Dick, and that's Harry. Instead, okay, yeah, that's the head. Okay, what's closer to the head? If you remember it that way, which one is lateral, which one is medial? Or another way is what's superior, what's inferior, greater, lesser? Then you won't go wrong. If you know what's tuberosity, basically you can see the protrusion here, deltoid tuberosity. Then along the shaft, any other question? So along the shaft. Now let's look at the distal end here. So distal end. What do we see on the distal end? See how the distal end has flat, smooth parts right there. Well, I kind of went beyond. So let's just do this. Let me trace those smooth parts the best I can right there. And you can also kind of see that in this flat, smooth part, looks like this is by itself. And these two are part of another one. So there are two compartments, two divisions here. So distal end of long bones. This is to articulate with the next two bones, radius and ulna. Okay. And bone to bone articulation, meaning we are talking about condyles. So the rule applies, the rule of thumb that applies to all long bones is that the distal end you will have condyles, on the proximal end you will have head. So this is how it will be for radius. Ulna is slightly different. Head of the radius will be its proximal end, head of the femur will be its proximal end, head of the tibia, head of the fibula, all going to be the proximal ends. And the distal ends have the condyles. That also then explains what is an epicondyle. Epi meaning above. If this is the condyle, I'm going to erase the distal end and I'm going to write condyle in its place. So, and we'll name the condyles in a second. Then what is an epicondyle? Epi meaning above. Epi, above. What is an epicondyle? What's slightly above and still protruding, identifiable as protrusion? If this is the condyle, well, how about this? How about this? And we already know that this is the medial, that's the lateral. Epicondyles are always named as medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. So what will my number one be? If you're giving it the name number one, what would we call this? One is what?
Medial.
Medial
Medial, what?
epicondyle.
Thank you. Medial epicondyle. Medial epicondyle. Number two is lateral epicondyle. See, if you learn it like that, I can't emphasize this enough. If you learn it like that, give a character to the story. You are going to be able to retain it. You're going to be able to identify it. Not only that, I know we are learning in the image, but you can actually transfer it in a real bone if you happen to work with a real bone. Doesn't look like it's going to happen this semester. Unless there is a vaccine, probably not next semester either. But anyway, I almost want to believe the conspiracy theorists that I read about in Quora that say, oh, after election, this corona threat is going to go away, everything is normal. It's all a ploy to blah, 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 blah. I almost want to believe because I want to go back to the campus. But medial, lateral, epicondyle. You can actually transfer this information to a three-dimensional bone if you have that story and its characters. This is what I keep saying for physiology, for anatomy too. Anatomy, I know students have a tendency to just have a visual memorization. Don't. Then you might be able to get, good grade in the anatomy exam, but you won't be able to retain it. You can only retain if you make up an underlying story. This is always my focus in physiology and anatomy. Point A, B, C, D, E. What's the specialty of each point and how do you connect the dots? This boosts your memory, this boosts your retention, this boosts your deductive reasoning power too, because we are using deductive reasoning here. We are applying, this is critical thinking. If this is the head, what is the medial? Okay, this. And then if this is the condyle, why is it condyle? This is where the other two bones will be, radius ulna, and this is for articulation, smooth surface, kind of like what we saw for occipital condyle. Then, okay, then this would be, these two will be condyle and these two will be epicondyle. And then how would you name them? Medial and lateral. If you name it like that, learn it like that, I guarantee that your retention, your understanding, and your reasoning and your application capacity all will be better, as opposed to randomly, we're just going to be tested on images. This is this, this is this, this is this, this is this. And in a class of 32 or 33, there is always one or two that think that, oh, I'm just going to pick up images and no one is watching. My lab exam and lecture exam scores match my face-to-face online. I'll make the exam such that you won't have time to cheat. And if you try to cheat on one answer, you'll be lagging behind in 5 answers. Don't even think. Spend the time in learning the bone instead. So did we get all of this? Because I'm going to erase most of this and go over the condyle. All right, so for humerus, some of this naming in anatomy also, they're kind of obsolete. There has been a movement to change the naming system and make it simpler. I think these are from a time when for naming a condyle, you are given, you had accolades and you are recognized. So people just wanted to name. Biologists just wanted to name whatever they can name. That movement has gained a little bit of momentum, but it hasn't been accepted fully yet. Okay, so I'm going to erase especially the epicondyles. Let's name the condyle. These two. Instead of calling these medial condyle and lateral condyle, which will be for other long bones, we are actually giving name based on their shape. Don't ask me why do we not call them medial and lateral, we just don't. We should be, but that's that movement is about. So the medial condyle, this is the medial condyle, because we know this is the medial aspect, and this would be the lateral condyle. Okay. So the medial condyle is referred to as trochlea. Medial condyle, trochlea. Which is trochlear shape. Then, basically, shape that's complex oftentimes is given the name trochlea, trochlear. You'll see that for inner ear, vestibule, sac-like chamber, trochlea, oh, too complex. So, complex, trochlea. Lateral condyle looks like a head, top of the head. This is referred to as capitulum. Only for humerus. Rest of the bones, you can call them medial condyle, lateral condyle, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. But here, it's given names. Let's look at the posterior aspect of the humerus. We can see the head, of course. On the posterior aspect, we can see the surgical neck, the anatomical neck, etc. You can see the back of the greater tubercle. You can still see the deltoid tuberosity. Can we see the epicondyles? Of course. But remember, wherever the head is, now the sides are switched. This is why medial and lateral, you want to have a reference. Wherever the head is, that side is the medial. Now the sides are switched. This is the head. That makes this medial epicondyle. That makes this lateral epicondyle. And what about this fossa, this depression? We kind of see the capitulum and trochlea as well. At least the trochlea is, you can see the trochlea right there. No, overshoot. Okay. How about this? This fossa, which is only visible on the posterior aspect, refer to this as olecranon fossa. Why olecranon? Because the part of ulna that articulates here is referred to as olecranon process. As you can see, humerus, radius ulna. So this part of the ulna, 3% stuff here. This part of the ulna, see that? This is what goes in here. This goes in here, like you see in this image. You can see the olecranon fossa. This part of the ulna is known as olecranon process. I see the chat flashing. Is there a question that I need to answer? Okay, so let's move on.
Sorry,
Let's look at the ulna. Okay, you have a question? Okay, tell me.
Yeah, I thought you had mentioned that the medial and lateral epicondyles, specifically for the humerus, had unique names.
No, condyle, not epicondyle. Condyles have unique name. Capitulum, yeah, the condyles are the capitulum and trochlea.
Trochlea.
Epicondyles are epicondyles.
Perfect. Okay, I just wanted to double check that. Thank you.
Sure. That's why I'm holding the, not face to face, holding it virtually so that you can ask questions there and there. Plus it gives a little bit of touch, you know, if you don't feel like you are so by yourself. That's scary. I mean, I don't like taking class online unless it's professional development. All right, so let's move on. Radius, I'm pretty sure you are capable of learning the radius on your own. We don't have head styloid process and ulnar notch. That's all we have. Okay, so head of the radius, the proximal end of the radius, head of the radius. Always say head of which bone? Okay, styloid. We have seen this before. Which bone? Temporal bone. Remember mastoid process, styloid process. Pointy. Styloid is pointy. Where is the pointy part of the radius here? Do we see a pointy part? Right? And the below, right there. This. So this is the styloid process mentioned as of radius because there is a styloid process of ulna. And then what else do I have? I have ulnar notch. Okay. So ulnar notch literally means, see how these two bones are together here? Radius and ulna, this is how they articulate. Also, this is the location. Radius is on the lateral side of your forearm. Ulna is on the medial side. So in your forearm, from anatomical position, meaning your thumb protruded out, thumb laterally, radius is the lateral bone, ulna is the medial bone. Back of your elbow, basically when you touch the elbow, you are touching that olecranon process. You are touching this part. But they are not straight because they're somewhat partly rotated here, just like they show here. So the ulnar notch is that part of the radius where the ulna rests. Notch is like a slight, not really exactly a full depression that you can give the name fossa. It's more like a very shallow depression. So there's a ulnar notch on radius, there's a radial notch on ulna, where these bones articulate with one another. And that ulnar notch is on the opposite side of the styloid process, on the medial aspect. So ulnar notch is here. So these are the three things that I have for radius. I was going to leave it for self-study, but I instead ended up talking about that. Let's look at the ulna. This is what I was talking about. The ulna, basically you are looking at the anterior view. Radius and ulna together. This is how these two bones articulate. They are not exactly straight next to one another, but rather a little bit, ulna is slightly rotated. If we know radius is the lateral bone, ulna is the medial bone, which side of your forearm is this? Is this left or right? Radius is medial, ulna is lateral. Which side is this, left or right?
Right side.
Is it? Radius is the lateral bone, ulna is the, oh gosh, I wrote opposite. I'm saying something and I'm writing something else. Ulna is the medial bone, radius is the lateral bone. In anatomical position, from anatomical position, ulna is the medial bone. Medial aspect of your forearm is made by ulna. Lateral aspect of your, meaning your pinky side, is made by ulna. Your thumb side is made by radius. Is this left or right? Medial is to the midline, meaning this is where your torso will be. This is where the humerus will be. Left or right?
Left.
Left, exactly. Always think that way. This helps you, again, build your understanding. Okay, so olecranon process. The protrusion, there you can't miss it. We have two protrusions on the ulna. Olecranon process and coronoid process. I'm going to draw them in two different colors. Olecranon process is the superior coronoid process is the inferior. Between olecranon and coronoid, see how this is kind of faceted? Basically, this surface, this is also called a notch. And this notch fits into the, let's look at the humerus. This fits into this. Because remember the head of the humerus, capitulum, trochlea, medial, lateral. This olecranon fits into the trochlea. So if we transfer this both of them here, the head of the radius will go against the capitulum, the olecranon will go against the trochlea, articulate with the trochlea. So guess what we call this notch? This notch.
Trochlear notch.
Trochlear notch.
Trochlear notch, exactly. So this is what I mean again, character to the story. And again, I really feel bad that this is how we have to learn. In a face-to-face class, we just articulate the bones together, and you can do that yourself. All right, so olecranon process, coronoid process, trochlear notch. Let me use a different color here. Pink is good. On the medial aspect of the trochlear notch, meaning slightly below, slightly toward the interior, there is a different notch right there. See that? This notch, where the head of the radius articulates with. Basically, that's what we are looking at here. Inferior to the coronoid process along the medial edge. This is the head of the radius, meaning what notch would we call that?
Radial notch.
Radial notch. Okay, so I'll try and challenge you, but because it's better to be challenged now. So radial notch meaning the radius goes here. If I'm to draw the radius here, is this left ulna or right ulna? If this is the radius, of course we can see the radial notch. So radius goes here. This is ulna, that's radius. We know that ulna is the medial bone, radius is the lateral bone. Which ulna is this, left or right?
Left.
Left, good. You guys are doing good. Okay. Then of course, styloid process of the ulna. Let me see what else do I have for the styloid process, yes. Styloid process of the ulna, right there. Always say styloid process of. I actually almost covered everything I wanted to cover. I thought I won't be able to, but. Got that? You can see the styloid process of ulna. You can see the olecranon. You can see the coronoid. Radial notch is a bit glare, so I won't look at that here, but here in this. Okay, so shall we move on? So once again, this is how these two bones will articulate. Let's move on to the carpals, metacarpals, phalanges that keeps us in a pretty good position. So what I try to do here, I try to show you the anatomical positioning of the carpals. So just to show you again, like what I was saying, carpals, we got 8 bones together that make up our wrist, and those are called the carpals. Right there, carpals, these make up your wrist. Then here are these are the, let me use a different color. These are the metacarpals, bones that make up your palm. And then we got this different color. Yes, purple is fine. These are the, no, that won't show up. All of this together, this constitute phalanges. Phalanx when you're looking at just a single, phalanges when you are referring to middle. All of them together in plural. So for the phalanges, I just have, proximal, middle, distal, pretty self-explanatory. Carpals typically can pose a little challenge. That's why I have this reference of the putting it on my own hand, thumb side out, anatomical positioning. So basically this is my left hand. So based on that, and if you remember, actually I needed to include the PC phone. So, okay. 2 rows of 8 bones. Out of which the last 2 bones, kind of, the 4th bone and the 8th bone. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the numbering of the bone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The names are, number 1 is scaphoid. I'm going to erase the metacarpals. I'm just going to write the names. I'm going to write them all in blue. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetral or triquetrum is the same thing. Triquetral, pisiform. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Trapezium, some call it trapezius, but that's not it's confusing because trapezius is a muscle. Trapezoid. Hemet. Whatever that means. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So scaphoid, boat-like. I usually don't worry about all of them. equilateral, triangular, pisiform. Pisiform is small, round. So I'm going to remove this pink. Look at that. Pisiform, number 4. If you are in anatomical position and you can actually touch, so basically below your palm, back of your hand, that is, back of your wrist, if you touch the back of your wrist, the medial edge of your wrist, which will be, hang on a second. Yeah, now my mouse will stop working. What I want to do is, wait, video. I'm going to show the video here. This part. So this is, you guys can see me? So anatomical position is like this, right? Thumb turned out. This is my, if I stand up, my anatomical position is this, thumb, away from the midline of the body. Okay. So if you are touching the back of your wrist, this little thing, round thing that you can feel with your finger, right there, here. Can you guys see me? This is the pisiform. So this is the pisiform. The other side of it, if you turn toward your palm and feel the base of your palm on the pinky side. This is the pinky side, yes? Base of your palm on the pinky side, you can feel, and you can do it right now with me. You can feel there's a bony thing there that feels a little, what should I say, pointy. This is the hemet. So it personally always has helped me to remember this, that if we touch the back of the palm, back of my hand, rather, at the edge of the wrist, right there, that little tiny circular bone that I'm feeling, this is pisiform. And if I'm looking at the base of the pinky side, this is what? Hemet. So you can identify now this as scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate. Hemet is hook-like. So look at the hemet here. Right there, the hook of the hemet. This is what I'm touching. This is what we are feeling. Pinky side at the base, this part, this is what we are feeling, hemet. This is the hemet. The sequence, I would say the best way, I remember it by, it's funny, it's very silly, but it works. The silly thing is that I remember it when somebody is drinking a very hot tea. Let's say you are drinking really hot tea. It's a typical unique sound that a person will make, like, you know, I remember it as that sound. SLTP, TTCH. That's how I remember it. SLTP, TTCH. You can come up with your own, you know, story to acronym to remember this. But if you remember pisiform and hemet, because those two are easily identifiable bone. Pisiform and hemet. And you remember their location and remember the sequence, you should be able to identify all of them. Additionally, knowing the boat-shaped scaphoid is also helpful. Otherwise, sometimes students will start here. They think 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5, 6, 7, 8. The pisiform becomes part of the second row. It's not. Scaphoid, neutral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezium. I can transfer that. when I don't the reference of the arm, I can still see both scalp. That basically ends our pectoral row and the upper extremity, bones of upper extremity. 12, 20. But that's good. Good figure. This is again just same thing. And for this bone,
Professor, I'm not sure what's happening, but I think a few of us, the screen's kind of freezing.